During World War II, Imperial Japan fielded one of the most diverse and complex air forces in the world. What many people don't realize is that Japan didn't have a single, unified air force. Instead, it had two completely separate and often rival services: the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force and the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service. Each had its own unique aircraft, its own design philosophies, and its own combat strategies. Major companies like Mitsubishi, Nakajima, and Kawasaki were the industrial backbone, churning out these incredible machines. From the very beginning, Japanese aircraft design prioritized three things: incredible range, exceptional maneuverability, and the skill of the pilot. This often came at the expense of things like armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. This trade-off brought them stunning early victories. But it would become a critical weakness as the war dragged on and Allied aircraft and tactics caught up. Let's start with the fighters of the Imperial Japanese Navy. And of course, that means we have to talk about the most famous Japanese aircraft of the entire war, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. When it first appeared in 1940, the Zero was a game-changer. It combined an astonishingly long range with maneuverability that no Allied fighter could match. In the early days of the Pacific War, from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, the Zero was the undisputed king of the skies. But its legendary status came with a price. That lack of armor and non-sealing fuel tanks made it notoriously fragile. Once Allied pilots learned to avoid dogfighting and use hit-and-run tactics, the Zero's vulnerability became tragically clear. As the war shifted in high altitude, American bombers like the B-29 Superfortress began attacking the Japanese mainland. The Navy needed a new kind of fighter. They needed a pure interceptor, designed for speed and a rapid climb rate, not for nimble dogfighting. That was the Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden, or Thunderbolt. The Raiden was a land-based interceptor, and while it was plagued by persistent engine problems throughout its service, it proved to be one of the few aircraft effective against the B-29 raids over Japan. Another powerful late-war fighter that deserves mention is the Kawanishi N-1 KJ Shiden, which translates to Violet Lightning. What's fascinating about the Shiden is that its design was actually derived from a floatplane. Despite its unusual origins, it was a beast of a machine. Armed with heavy cannons, it was one of Japan's most formidable interceptors, capable of taking on the best Allied fighters like the Hellcat and Corsair, especially when flown by an experienced pilot. The main problem was keeping them in the air due to maintenance challenges. The Navy knew the Zero wouldn't last forever, and they planned a successor, the Mitsubishi A7M Reppu or Hurricane on paper. The Reppu was everything they needed: a powerful, well-armed fighter that fixed many of the Zero's flaws. But development was hit with constant delays, and by the time it was ready for testing, the war was practically over. It was a case of too little, too late. Now, let's switch over to the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force. Its replacement was the Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, or Peregrine Falcon, which became the Army's most produced fighter of the war. Much like the Navy's Zero, the Hayabusa was all about agility and long range. It was a very successful aircraft in the early years, but it faced the same problems as the Zero. It just couldn't stand up to the heavier, more powerful Allied fighters that appeared later in the war. A major change in Army fighter design came with the Kawasaki Ki-61 Heen or Swallow. This was unique because it used a liquid-cooled inline engine. Similar to the German Messerschmitt Bf-109, this gave the Heen better speed and performance at high altitude compared to its air-cooled cousins. But the German-derived engine was notoriously difficult for Japanese mechanics to maintain in the field, leading to serious reliability issues. Arguably the best fighter the Army ever produced was the Nakajima KT-4 Hoyat, the Gale. This aircraft was a true masterpiece. It combined speed, an excellent climb rate, and heavy armament. When it was well built and running on high-quality fuel, the KT-4 could go toe-to-toe with any Allied fighter, including the P-51 Mustang. The problem was when, by the time it entered mass production, Japan's industry was being hammered by bombing raids, and material shortages led to a sharp decline in manufacturing quality. Many Hayats were grounded simply because they couldn't be built or maintained properly. Of course, Japan's naval power was built on its aircraft carriers, which required specialized strike aircraft. The IJAAF Val dive bomber was an absolute star in the early war. It was incredibly accurate and played a central role in sinking Allied ships, most famously at Pearl Harbor. It was eventually replaced by the much faster Yokosuka D4Y, a versatile plane that served as a dive bomber, reconnaissance aircraft, and, tragically, as a kamikaze plane in the final year of the war. For torpedo attacks, the Navy relied on the Nakajima B-5N. This was the aircraft that delivered the devastating torpedo runs against the American battleships at Pearl Harbor and crippled Allied fleets across the Pacific. But it was slow and highly vulnerable without fighter cover. Its successor, the Nakajima B-6 Zero, was faster and carried a more powerful torpedo, but it arrived when Japan's carrier force was already a shadow of its former self. Japan also operated a powerful force of land-based bombers for long-range missions. The Navy used the Mitsubishi G3M Nell and the more famous Mitsubishi G4M Betty. The G4M was legendary for its incredible range, allowing it to strike targets deep in enemy territory. However, it earned the grim nickname the Flying Lighter from Allied pilots because its unprotected fuel tanks would ignite with even the slightest damage. The Army had its own bombers, like the Nakajima Ki-49, which was designed to be more survivable but was unfortunately underpowered. Their best heavy bomber was the Mitsubishi Ki-67 Hiryu or Flying Dragon. The Ki-67 was fast, durable, and versatile. It could act as a heavy bomber, a torpedo bomber, and a platform for special attacks. It was likely Japan's most effective bomber of the war, but like so many other advanced designs, it arrived too late to change the outcome. Reconnaissance was another area where Japan excelled. The Mitsubishi Ki-46 Dyna was a twin-engine high-speed reconnaissance plane that was so fast it was almost impossible for Allied fighters to intercept for much of the war. And we can't forget Japan's incredible flying boats. The Kawanishi H-6K and its successor, the Kawanishi H-8K Emily, were giants of the sky. They conducted long-range maritime patrols and reconnaissance missions across the vast Pacific Ocean. The H-8K in particular was considered one of the best flying boats of the entire war, heavily armed, with great range and endurance, to support its sprawling empire. Japan relied on transport aircraft like the Mitsubishi Ki-57 and the Takikawa Ki-54. They also produced a licensed version of the American DC-3, called the L-2D, which moved troops and supplies everywhere. And of course, thousands of pilots learned their craft in trainers like the Yokosuka K-5Y and the Takikawa Ki-9. Though the quality of pilot training dropped dramatically as the war turned against Japan, as defeat became inevitable, Japan turned to desperate and experimental technology. The Nakajima Kicker was Japan's first jet aircraft, inspired by the German Me-262. It managed one test flight just before the war ended. There was also the Mitsubishi J-8M Shusui, a rocket-powered interceptor based on the German Me-163 Comet.